Hi everyone and welcome to another product comparison / review video. I'm going to be reviewing the Millford paper by St Cuthberts Mill, which is a replacement for the Whatman watercolour papers that were discontinued in the 1980s but were apparently loved by all because they're really heavily sized, which means the paint stays on the top, doesn't sink in, you get great luminosity, great brightness, really beautiful colours, and above all you can do washes that are soaking wet with no problems. You can lift paints that don't normally lift because they haven't soaked in and actually dyed the fibres, and you can scrub at it and abuse it and it tolerates it. So I've got a few sample sheets of it and I'm going to do some trials, and I just want to explain first of all what I'm going to do. So the comparison products are, first of all, Bockingford, £140, 300 GSM, cold press, white. You can see the texture on that. It is a chemical pulp paper. It does not have any cotton in it, and its sizing is okay. I find it struggles with masking fluid and masking tapes, so that's part of the comparison. How does Millford compare? But it's my general everyday paper and I'm pretty pleased with it. Saunders Waterford I really love. This is a 100% cotton paper, same weight, same press, same colour, slightly different texture, which usually means the felts have been changed, so the lovely people at St Cuthberts Mill have informed me. It is much more strongly sized. It's got a surface sizing with gelatine and an internal sizing with gelatine, and it's obviously 100% cotton, so it's quite a different paper to work with. Finally, the Millford, the special one. This is a smaller sheet. I have got a bigger one, but I want to save that to do a kind of, if it works, I'll do a painting on it. Same weight, same press, same colour again. You can see the texture there. It's 100% cotton again. It is what they call hard sized, so it's got much harder sizing. Now, I'm told Millford is actually made to Whatman's recipe. So St Cuthberts Mill actually bought the recipe or were given the recipe by Whatman when they stopped making it in the 80s. And the really important thing to remember is Whatman actually really invented modern watercolour paper in the 1750s when they learned how to make a paper with no texture on the surface, so that one could impart one by cold pressing the paper or running it through hot rollers to make sure it had no texture at all. And that was really how modern watercolour paper came about. And they used to do a hard size. I want you to see the texture of it really because it's quite beautiful. They used to do a hard size back in those days, which was done using potash alum, which I've explained more about in a blog post that kind of accompanies this. And that with gelatine cross-links and makes a really hard kind of gel, and when that dries down you get a hard, almost glossy film normally, and obviously they do it in a way that's not glossy, and that is really, it's not waterproof, but it does hold water for quite some time. So that's the kind of secret size that they were using. Now the problem with that is that alum has got pH issues for archival reasons, and the aluminium that's present in it is not great for archival reasons either because metals react with things. So they started to use different sizes. They started to use buffers within the paper, pH buffers, so that, for archival reasons it wouldn't gain acid and turn yellow on you. I don't know what Millford use nowadays. I have no idea what their sizing actually is. All they say is it's a hard sizing. I'm assuming gelatine is probably involved, but I don't actually know what they're using, and I will ask the people at St Cuthberts Mill to tell me what they can tell me, because they have been so helpful and they've given me so many samples to review and some actual full-size packs of product just so that I can try them and spread the word really. Caveat before I review this is not product placement. No one has paid me to do these reviews. No one has given me products to say you like our products and we'll give you free stuff. That has not happened. The company have given me stuff to review. They've given me stuff just to see if I like them as an artist and spread the word to other artists that they're lots of fun. At no point have they told me I must say anything's lots of fun. At no point have they given me any kind of incentives for doing anything. I've been totally honest with them. They've been totally honest with me. I'm the first person to say Bockingford ain't perfect. I don't like the way it reacts with masking fluid. I don't like the way it reacts with tape. Saunders Waterford, much as I love it, has got a really, really annoying texture at times, and it can make your paint feel really very dry when one's painting on it. So I'm not a fan of that surface feel that it has. I just don't quite like it. So I don't think any of these papers are perfect, and that's kind of the attitude I'm going in with. The tests I'm going to do are going to involve some mineral pigment based paints and some dye based paints, and I'm going to use paints that traditionally lift well, so where the dyes are not really that staining, and I'm going to use ones where the dyes are really staining, and we'll see how well they lift or don't lift on the 3 different papers. Once I know how they'll behave, I'll do a painting on the other sheet, which is like this kind of size, bigger sheet, and we'll see how it goes. So this is the beginning of my review. Let's see what happens. Okay, I have now tested the Millford papers and done a couple of different tests. Well, it's a product comparison, I'm not just testing the Millford papers. So I'll just show you on one of the papers what I've done. And I'm now working with a slightly different setup. I've borrowed a tripod off of a friend, which doesn't have a wonky leg like my other one, and it's heavy enough that I should be able to do some totally overhead filming in the future. So I'm really excited about that. I'm going to show you first of all, I'm sorry we're at a little bit of a distance. That's to do with me needing to move some things around here. So just to show you what I've done, first of all I put a piece of watercolour tape or painter's tape onto each piece of test paper, stuck it down really hard. That was my first test. I applied some masking fluid, and that was the Winsor Newton what's it called, Winsor Newton Art Masking Fluid, which is this one here. And I did start out with a Frisk one, the one that's in the bottle with the needle applicator, but it looks like it's separated, so I quite quickly swapped it to this one. So I'm going to see how these peel off and if they damage the paper. I then applied a number of different paints, and I did them as follows. So I did phthalo green yellow shade first of all. Just ignore this blurring, I'll come to that later. Phthalo green yellow shade, which is a dye-based pigment, and it stains very heavily, so it's really hard to lift. Viridian, which I did a couple of streaks of just to sort of see how that one went compared to the others. I did Pyrrole Red, which is sold as Winsor Red, just so you know, and Phthalo Green Yellow Shade is sold as Winsor Green Yellow Shade. These are all Winsor & Newton Artist Grade, I should have said. So 721 Winsor Green Yellow Shade is what they sell it as. 726 Winsor Red, which is really Pyrrole Red, so I tend to call them by their real names because it's easier for me to remember. So that one went on. That's dye-based but is not quite sustaining. I then did Quinacridone Magenta, which is this one here, and this beautiful yellow, that is Nickel Azo Yellow, if my memory serves. Let me just check it. Yeah, it's Nickel Azo Yellow, and they sell it as 653 transparent yellow, but it's the Nickel Azo Yellow. So that's a diazonium dye as a nickel pigment, so you can see the luminosity of that. It's really, really beautiful. And Cuthbert Mortuum, Death's Head in Latin, which is one of the iron oxide pigments, and you'll see those in my iron pigment video that I've done separately. And you can see how it sits on the paper. It's a very dense mineral pigment. So this and Viridian sit on the paper, the others are dyes. The reason is I wanted to look at how these things lift. So once each one had been on for 1 minute, what I then did is I put a palette knife on the page and I brushed clean water up and down, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, blotted with kitchen paper. And I want to see how well these things lift in comparison to each other. So the tests we're looking at here are how the colours look compared to the other papers. These were all done by making washes of each colour in a palette and brushing on a brush load onto each piece of paper. So they all got exactly the same paint, the same density, the same brush. It was my trusty Prolene Plus Filbert. They didn't all get the same shaped blob because papers are different shapes. So they didn't all get the same amount. So I did that, and that was done after 1 minute. So in some cases the paint wasn't dry at all at that point. And I did that with these pigments here. Sorry, these pigments here. This one here I'll come on to in just a moment and tell you what that is. And I did it with this one. With Quin Magenta and Transparent Yellow and Nickel Azo Yellow, I did a slightly different technique. What I did with those was I scrubbed back and forth with a wet brush, again 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, to see if these would lift and mix together. And I found that on Bockingford, Quin Magenta stayed where it is and Nickel Azo Yellow reliquefied, if you like. So I did them as a streak of this and a streak of this almost immediately, one after the other. Then I did this after a minute to see if I could relift them and mix them. This test here I painted on a puddle of water and I dropped along one edge that wash I'd made of Quin Magenta and along this edge the wash I'd made of phthalo green yellow shade to see how wet the paper would stay and for how long, so how much these merged into one another. So let's have a look at the colours and the lifting, and I'm going to do another lifting experiment after this where I'm going to lift them now they've been on there for 48 hours to see if they'll lift now they're totally dry. So let's compare Bockingford with Saunders Waterford first of all. Saunders Waterford being the 100% cotton paper with better sizing but allegedly not so good as Millford. So let's just see how the colours compare side by side. Let's look at these greens first of all. I think they're possibly a little brighter on Bockingford, but that's probably because the paper is a cleaner white because it's a chemical pulp paper, whereas this is a cotton paper. So Saunders Waterford is a little bit dull. They now sell a high white in the same range, which is as white as this. So I think that's why that looks a little dull. And same with the Viridian. In terms of the lifting, the Viridian didn't really lift at all on Bockingford, but a little bit more on this one. Whereas the phthalo green yellow shade lifted pretty well on Saunders Waterford. It's, remember, a very staining pigment, but not quite so well here. The paper here does feel odd, like the gum arabic's on its own. Like the gum arabic's still there, it's almost a little sticky. The Quin Magentas, I think, again, brighter. These are brighter on Bockingford. Not quite so bright here. When I did that lifting, the yellow lifted but the pink didn't, and the yellow lifted okay. Here the yellow lifts better but the pink again doesn't. The Cuthbert Mortuum really didn't want to lift on Bockingford or on Saunders Waterford, and the Pyrrole Red probably lifted a little bit better on Bockingford actually than it did on Saunders Waterford. I don't know how well, oops, I'm just slipping. I don't know how representative that is really of you know, other similar dyes. These two that I added wet on wet, I think they blended more on Saunders Waterford, so it stayed wetter for longer than on Bockingford, but the colours seem brighter on Bockingford, presumably because it dried down reasonably quickly. Sorry, I'm thinking backwards here, let me get this the right way around. On Saunders Waterford, the paper stayed wetter for longer, so they had more time to spread around, whereas on Bockingford, it dried down very quickly, which is why they've sort of stayed where they are along the two edges. Sorry, I wasn't thinking the right way around there. And so the reason these are paler is just that they've diffused more, which is why there's this mud in the middle. So that's kind of how they compare. I'm going to keep Bockingford in my hand. No, I'm going to keep Saunders Waterford as a control, because at least that's a cotton paper with quite heavy sizing. So one would expect it to have similar results to Millford. They should, in theory, be fairly similar. So here's Millford. I think some of those colours are brighter on Millford than they are on Waterford. So let's compare them. Yeah, I mean the Quin green, sorry, I keep saying that, the phthalo green here. Let's compare Bockingford, so we've got a white and a white. So Millford in the middle, Bockingford, Saunders Waterford. I think the Bockingford is, is very bright, but it looks quite pale. But on this one, it's got a bit more dimension because it's got this darker edge. And I'll tell you what caused that in a moment. Looking at the others, I think on the whole, I think Millford has got a bit more brightness with the dye-based pigments, things like the Quin Magenta, I got it right that time, and the Transparent Yellow, where there are these sort of dye-based things, but I can't tell the difference really with the others. So certainly these are much sort of brighter and lighter colours. Now the reason we get this kind of heavy patch along the edge is really simple. The paint on Millford when I was doing this stayed wet for absolutely ages. It really just sat there. And because I had this easel that I used for filming just at a very slight angle, it's probably about 20 degrees, the paint obviously just kind of went this way in the water, so there's a slightly darker edge, and I actually like that. I think it gives a little bit of dimension and it makes it a bit less flat, so I was quite pleased to see that. Let's just compare the lifting for a moment. So I've got Saunders Waterford here. Look at the lifting of that phthalo green compared to this. I mean, it's completely gone. That paper is nearly white here, so that lifted brilliantly. The Viridian, again, that is almost clean white, whereas this really isn't. The Caput Mortuum was not so successful. It didn't lift here on Saunders Waterford, and it doesn't really lift well over here either. It moves, you can see it has actually sort of moved around, but it hasn't moved around very well. I think that's a really dense iron pigment. It tends to sink onto the paper, and it tends to want to stay there because it's big, heavy particles. Once the gum arabic's gone, they tend to just want to clump and sink. So I think that could be why it's a really hard one to lift on any paper. The Pyrrole Red didn't really lift here on the Saunders Waterford at all, but completely lifted on the Millford. I mean, there's a pink stain there, but hey, I mean, that's pretty complete lifting. When I did these two colours to see how they would lift, if you remember on the other two papers, the pink doesn't lift, but the yellow does. They both lifted and formed this delightful mud. So even Quinacridone Magenta, and quinacridones tend to stain really well, just like the phthalocyanines do. That's a really good sign that this paper is great for lifting those difficult staining pigments. Not so good for those difficult dense metal pigments, but I'll put that in my sum up at the end. So I would say Millford has got brighter colours with these dye-based pigments, and they lift even the difficult ones, and that was great. And that was, you know, after they'd had time to dry. Obviously I'm going to redo that in a moment, and I'm going to do a kind of 48-hour lift and see how well they'll lift then, so we'll see how successful that is. Next, let's look at how those masks function. So Bockingford, first of all, I've got here, this is really cheap Artist Loft, which is a shit brand, I don't mind saying. I'm really not impressed with their products, but the reason I like their painter's tape is that it's rubbish, so it's really easy to get back off the paper, but it does still tear Bockingford usually. Now we've got really high humidity here at the moment, so this might be easier than normal. Yeah, that's actually come off a lot more easily than normal, but it could just be because it's a small piece and there's no moisture crept under it. So that's worked. It hasn't obviously pulled anything off the paper. Let's look at Saunders Waterford. Now I'm going to try and treat these all in exactly the same way. Yep, that's come off completely cleanly. And notice I'm pulling it back on itself because that's always a good way to get masking tape off without tearing. So the next thing to look at is masking fluid, which I applied here, and it's been on there. I was naughty. Normally you leave masking fluid on for 3 hours, but I'm kind of doing the Daz Doorstep Challenge. I'll put a note in the video to explain what that is to our colleagues in other countries who may not understand it. I'm kind of doing the Daz Doorstep Challenge here, so I'm trying to absolutely abuse this paper. I left this on for 24 hours to see what would happen, because that's normally the point where it totally ruins the paper. So let's have a look. Oh yeah, definitely. And sod's law, it came off in one piece. How annoying. Normally Bockingford is the first paper to tear with masking fluid, but I think, to be honest, it tends to be when you paint it over it and moisture creeps under it that causes that tearing to happen. The little tiny tear just happened then. But that's largely okay. I mean, I think if you just kind of gave that a little rub, that would probably be okay. Saunders Waterford next. This masking fluid didn't go on too well here. I put quite a lot on. But this paper generally copes reasonably well with mask when I've used it before. And I'm not being gentle because, again, trying to abuse it. That's come off cleanly. What I'll do on another area of the paper, there's a tiny, I don't know if you can see, there's a really tiny tear there. What I'll do when I do the second lift on a spare bit of the paper, I'll put some masking fluid on and then I'll paint over it after it's dried, leave it a few hours and then see how that copes, because that could be quite interesting. Millford next. Do you know, that was totally different experience. That was really easy to get off. It just came off really easily. I mean, there's a little bit of abrasion of the paper there where it was, but not much. I actually put 2 blobs on because I just kind of added some more by accident, so I thought I'll put a bit more on. I mean, it's a very fine, almost invisible layer of paper, which I think is actually just the sizing. And I think what that actually is left behind is a bit of masking fluid that didn't really come on properly, so I could precipitate in the masking fluid, or the sizing is slightly discoloured. It's not that the paper's damaged, but that came off really easily compared to the other papers. So in that regard, I'm really impressed with it. I have to say, I am actually really impressed with Millford so far. To remind you all, Bockingford is my kind of everyday practice paper. Saunders Waterford is what I use when I make something I want to give as a gift, or that I intend to put into a craft fair or something like that. And Millford I have never used before. This is the first time I've ever really used it in the last 24 hours. So I'm wondering whether I want to start using this instead of Waterford at the moment. That's my honest feedback. So my next step is going to be a 24-hour lift of these paints to see how they lift now after they've had a really good long time. And then after I've done that, I'll do a masking fluid, let it dry, probably leave it an hour, paint over it, let the paint dry, and then try removing it on camera. And we'll see how that goes. And then we'll have a proper look at these papers again, and I'll put some final conclusions together, and I think I'll put those kind of in writing in a slide at the end of the video maybe, so that it's really easy to see how the papers compared. I might even do a table. Let's get daring. I might put a table in my download section on my website maybe, so that you could, if you wanted to kind of do a side-by-side comparison of their properties, a table with ticks and crosses maybe, so that you can make a comparison, and maybe I'll add some other papers to that as well. But these ones are all made by St Cuthberts Mill, and they're pretty common brands. You can buy Saunders Waterford art journals, you can buy Bockingford sketchbooks made by multiple different companies now. Loads of companies use these papers in their products, so that's why I wanted to review them. But Millford, just to remind everyone, is only available as full imperial, half imperial and quarter imperial sheets. And you can only get it in 300 gram per square metre, which is £140, and in cold press white. That is all they make. But I think given how special this paper is, it's worth buying a mil pack of this and getting it cut down into a size that's actually useful. So back shortly with that 24-hour lifting and the second masking fluid challenge. Right, second time lucky. Now continuing my review of Millford, Bockingford and Saunders Waterford from St Cuthberts Mill. As I said at the beginning, this is really a Millford review, but as I'm comparing it with the other products, I need to explain them all. So, further to what I said last time, I've painted on masking fluid, let it dry, painted over it with paint, let that dry, and then removed it. And the masking fluid I used was Pebio's drawing gum, which is a blue masking fluid, simply because my normal Winsor Newton masking fluid seems to be going kind of lumpy, and I needed to get some new masking fluid, and I figured as I had a brand new bottle, I may as well use that. So what I did was I painted it on, let it dry, I painted over it. This is Perylin Maroon because I happen to have some left over in that dish there from a painting, so I thought I'd use it. And then I removed them when it had been on about 3 hours. So it was on half an hour to dry, painted over it, 3 hours later, took it off. So Bockingford, as you can see, tore quite badly, and that is typical of my experience with Bockingford thus far, really. Saunders Waterford was fine. I thought it was a little bit rough in the middle. I was a bit worried it had kind of exfoliated the paper, but actually it's fine. And Millford was totally fine. Again, really easy to remove. I found that one the easiest to get off. Again, same as the first time round. I then took those paints that were on here and I did a 24-hour lift. So these paints have been dried on for 24 hours and I attempted a second lift. So you can see phthalo green. Let me get these the right way round. I can't remember which one was the original and which one was the 24 hours. I think that's the 24-hour one. Didn't go too well. I tried it with the Quinacridone Magenta and the transparent yellow. Didn't really work. Pyrrole red didn't want to lift. Cuthberts Mortuum really did not want to lift at 24 hours, and Viridian I didn't bother with. With Saunders Waterford it was a little different. Phthalo green really did not want to lift on this paper. Pyrrole red, that was the 1 hour, and the 24 hours it really did not want to lift there at all. Sorry, I'm just trying to see in the screen on the camera, it's a bit fiddly. Quinacridone Magenta didn't really lift at all in that area there, neither did transparent yellow. Cuthberts Mortuum at 24 hours, very, very slight. And I did bother with Viridian on this one, and it barely lifted at all. Millford, last but not least, 24 hours transparent yellow did lift. You can see that. It's not perfect, but it did lift. Phthalo green at 24 hours kind of lifted a bit, but not much. Cuthberts Mortuum at 24 hours lifted better on this paper than the others, but not much. Pyrrole red lifted better on this paper than others, but not much. And Viridian lifted brilliantly at 24 hours. Most of it went. And the Quinacridone Magenta actually lifted a reasonable amount as well. So my overall review of those in terms of those properties is that actually everything lifts better on Millford. This is the paper. If you want to do lifting, even a day later, Millford is the paper for you. Even heavily staining pigments like Quinacridone Magenta did lift to some extent. And remember, I did a controlled lift here. I did 5 strokes of a wet brush, then blotted. So I reckon I could have got that off completely if I just kept going, but that's not what I was aiming to do. So I decided to do a comparison of the 2 cotton papers. First of all, Saunders Waterford, and secondly, Millford. And I used the leftover paint that's in my Daisy palette over there, namely Perylene Green, Perylene Maroon, Quinacridone Gold, Green Gold and Sepia. I didn't use any of the Endancerine Blue that's in there just because I kind of ran out of space on the paper. And these are just leftovers from a painting that I was doing. And so these are washes, these are the same batch of the same wash. And I painted it on one paper, I washed the brush, reloaded it, painted it on the other paper. So everything was equivalent. Let's look at Saunders Waterford first of all. It's very, very neutralised. So just to explain what I did, I started actually at this one first. At Perylene Green first, and while this was wet on dry. Then I put on some Quin Gold, then Green Gold, then some more Quin Gold, because I knew I'd get brown otherwise. And then, so this is Quin Gold next to Perylene Maroon. These are quite pale. You know, this is a little bit granular, but that's because of the consistency of the paper, not because it's a granulating paint. Same over here, it's just that it's a cotton paper, so you don't get the perfectly smooth finish. And this is Sepia. Now Sepia is, so just to explain, these are all dye-based single pigment paints. I think Quin Gold might have multiple pigments in it, but it's dye-based. Sepia has got several dyes and carbon powder suspended in it, so it's a little bit different, and that does granulate, so that is real granulation. I did the same on Millford, remember, same washes, same everything, and it sits on the surface of the paper. I let these dry completely flat so long that it sinks in where it is, and it does give you totally different coloration. Let's just compare the Perylene Greens next to each other. There is so much more vibrancy and colour here. because it's dried where it sits, the water is evaporated and the dye is left behind, you do get a much more interesting surface texture. So this is the cotton paper where I think it's sunk in on Saunders Waterford. You can see the weave of the paper as the texture. That's what the texture is, it's the weave of the paper. This Millford, this is not the weave of the paper, this is dried dye basically. So on Millford you get a totally different experience. You can't really compare the Quin Golds next to each other too well, but you can see this one is brighter, more vibrant, it has more texture to it. The green gold is a little bit insipid on it, but I think the wash was pretty thin. The Perylene Maroon I actually went out on the side because I realised I hadn't left myself enough space to do it because I did the Sepia first. Again, it's got wonderful texture to it. Let's compare them. Remember, same wash, dried flat, same everything. It's totally different. On the Millford there is just life to these colours. They gain a darker edge because they're drying by evaporation rather than soaking in, and you get these wonderful dark areas. And then even the Sepia, which is really boring normally, let me turn them around so that they're the same. Even this Sepia appears darker and has much more consistency to it. And where it bled accidentally into the Perylene Maroon here, it sat on the top. It didn't just sort of bleed everywhere. It stayed kind of where it was, which I thought was interesting. So on the whole, if you use dye-based inks, Millford. That's all I could say. Sorry, dye-based paints. If you like dye-based paints, I really, really recommend Millford. It's great for lifting. You get these wonderful textures you just can't get on other cotton papers. Cotton papers, you tend to get this similar effect on them, but this is fantastic. And remember, this is the same wash. This is not that I put more paint on here. Everything is exactly the same. So totally fair test. You get better lifting, the colours are more vibrant, it is everything the manufacturers promised. And of course, because on Waterford you get a quite slow dry down, when I put the Quin Gold, the Quin Magenta and the Phthalo Green here, they blended a bit but not much because they dried. Whereas when I did it with this paper, they merged together a lot more and went muddy because they'd been there so long, because the paper stays wet. The sizing is so strong that just sits as a puddle until it dries by evaporation. So you do get mixing, they do have time to diffuse together. So again, if you want to do wet into wet washes, this is a brilliant paper. I cannot recommend Millford paper any more strongly. The downsides, the price. It is not cheap. An imperial sheet is probably twice the price of Bockingford. It only comes in one weight, which is 300 gram per square metre or £140, which for me is too thin because I like my paper about 425 grams, 610 grams, so 300, 350 pounds. I'd have to stretch this and that would annoy me. It only comes in cold press, which is a shame because I like rough paper, so I actually prefer rough as my texture rather than cold press, but I can live with cold press. And okay, it only comes in white. That's not the end of the world. I like the tinted papers I tried last week from Bockingford, but so what? I could live without them. So if this came in different weights and wasn't extortionate, I would switch to this completely and I would never use anything else. As it stands, I'm going to try switching to this for a while and see how I get on. I hope you have liked these videos. If you want to try Millford yourself, I've put some links in the description where you can buy it, but it does only come in imperial, half imperial and quarter imperial sheets. You can't get it as blocks, you can't get it as books, you can't get it in any smaller sizes, so you have to buy a 30-inch by 22-inch sheet and cut it down. That's the most economical method. Or you can buy half that or quarter that sheets, and then you wouldn't have to trim it down quite so much. But I buy the big ones. They're cheaper. Bit awkward, but they're cheaper. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.